In the heart of Westbridge, a police station stands divided, a place meant to protect its community, but quietly crumbling under the weight of corruption. At the center of the chaos is Emily Carter, a determined leader with a promise to keep and a past shaped by betrayal and resilience. When Emily steps in as the new chief of police, she expects resistance, but nothing prepares her for the dangerous game she is about to uncover. Beneath the surface lies a network of power and deceit, held together by Greg Sanders, an embittered officer who has spent years manipulating the system to his advantage. What starts as a battle for respect quickly turns into a war for the soul of the department, with lives and reputations hanging in the balance. Anonymous accusations, public protests, and desperate schemes force Emily to confront not only the external forces working against her, but also the internal fears that threaten to shake her resolve. But Emily isn't alone. A young officer finds his courage. An old ally stands by her side, and the truth she holds becomes a weapon stronger than the lies that seek to destroy her. What drives someone to betray the oath they swore to uphold? And how far is too far when fighting to make things right? Emily Carter walked up the worn steps of the Westbridge Police Department, her boots clicking softly against the pavement. The morning air was cool, filled with the faint hum of a waking city. Emily paused for a moment, staring up at the building's weathered facade. The glass windows reflected the pale gray sky, making the station appear colder than it already felt. Her heart pounded beneath her simple gray jacket. She adjusted the strap of her shoulder bag and took a deep breath before pushing open the heavy double doors. The scent of burnt coffee and disinfectant greeted her as she stepped inside. Emily's living situation wasn't lavish. She rented a small apartment on the outskirts of Westbridge, a modest place with chipped paint and an old radiator that only worked half the time. The place was filled with hand-me-down furniture, but it was hers. It was where she spent countless nights sitting at a scarred kitchen table, studying case files under the dim glow of a desk lamp. Her grandmother Ruth's picture sat by the window, a reminder of why she chose this path. The station lobby buzzed with low conversation and the hum of old computer monitors. No one looked up when Emily entered. To the officers here, she was just another civilian looking for help, another face among many. Officer Greg Sanders sat behind the front desk. His broad shoulders filled his chair, and his uniform was unbuttoned at the collar. He scrolled lazily through his computer screen, eyes half-lidded. When Emily stepped up to the desk, Greg glanced at her with disinterest. "What do you need?" he asked in a clipped tone, barely masking his irritation. Emily set her bag down and met his gaze steadily. "I am here to report a theft." Greg raised an eyebrow, finally taking her in the plain jacket, the long brown hair pulled neatly into a ponytail, the steady but calm way she spoke. "Another one?" He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Let me guess your phone. Your purse? Those things never turn up again, lady." Emily's expression didn't shift. "I would like to file a report," she repeated, her tone firm but even. Greg leaned back in his chair and reached for the large cup of coffee on his desk. "Listen," he said slowly, "we have bigger things to deal with than petty stuff." He stood and took a step closer, his presence looming. His voice dropped to a quieter, more threatening tone. "People like you should know their place." Before Emily could respond, Greg tilted his coffee cup and splashed the steaming liquid toward her. The hot coffee hit her cheek and soaked into the front of her shirt. The heat stung her skin, but she barely flinched. Her breath caught for a second, and the world around her seemed to hold its breath too. The murmur of conversation in the station stopped as the coffee dripped to the tiled floor. Emily raised her hand and wiped her face. Her cheek throbbed from the heat, but her gaze remained locked on Greg's. The pity and discomfort she sensed from the surrounding officers only fueled her resolve. "Thank you," Emily said quietly, her voice unwavering. "Now I see exactly how things work around here." Greg blinked, his smirk faltering for the briefest moment. but Emily didn't give him time to recover. She turned and walked out of the station, her footsteps echoing in the silence. At the end of the hallway, Deputy Chief James Warren stood waiting. He was middle-aged, with kind but tired eyes. His neatly pressed uniform and polished badge contrasted with the tension in his posture. "Are you all right?" James asked, stepping forward. His voice was soft but edged with concern. Emily stopped and took a deep breath. "I am fine," she replied, though her shirt was still damp, and her cheek burned. James hesitated before speaking again. "I heard what happened," he admitted. "You insisted that we stay quiet and not reveal anything until you could see the station for yourself." Emily nodded, loosening her ponytail and letting her hair fall over her shoulders. The strands partially covered the reddened mark on her cheek. "I needed to see it with my own eyes," she said, her voice quieter now, but tinged with a restrained anger. James sighed, running a hand through his short, graying hair. "You've seen it," he said gravely. "What now?" Emily's gaze sharpened. "Now I make sure it never happens again." The walk home that day felt longer than usual. The chill in the air deepened as the sky darkened. Emily's apartment was quiet when she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The familiar scent of old wood and fresh laundry greeted her. She dropped her bag by the door and walked to the small mirror by the kitchen window. Her reflection stared back at her, tired but unbroken. She gently touched the spot on her cheek where the coffee had burned her. The memory of Greg's smug expression replayed in her mind. As she washed her face with cool water, her thoughts drifted to her grandmother Ruth. She remembered the nights when Ruth would sit at the table with her, recounting stories of civil rights marches and tireless fights for justice. Ruth had always told her, "Justice isn't something you wait for, Emily. It's something you build step by step, no matter how long it takes." Emily smiled faintly at the memory, though her heart ached. Ruth had passed away 5 years ago, but her legacy lived on in Emily's determination. Later that evening, a soft knock at her door broke the silence. When Emily opened it, she was surprised to see her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, holding a small dish of homemade soup. "I saw you come home looking tired, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, her eyes warm. "I thought you could use a bit of comfort." Emily blinked, momentarily speechless. "Thank you," she said, taking the dish. Mrs. Henderson smiled. "You remind me of your grandmother," she said fondly. "She always looked out for others. Take care of yourself, Emily." As Emily closed the door, the simple act of kindness settled over her like a warm blanket. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the dish of soup. The sting of the day began to fade, replaced by a quiet strength. The fight ahead would not be easy, but Emily knew that she wasn't alone. As she sipped the warm broth, she felt the flicker of hope reignite within her, a hope that reminded her why she chose this path. The journey for justice had only begun. The next morning, Emily Carter woke early to the soft light filtering through the thin curtains of her small apartment. The air was crisp, and the quiet hum of the city outside was a welcome calm before the storm she knew was coming. She stood at the window for a moment, watching people begin their day, delivery drivers unloading packages, children walking to school with backpacks too big for their frames. Emily's heart felt heavier today, but she wasn't someone who let fear take the wheel. After a quick breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, she grabbed her coat and headed out the door. The station loomed just ahead as she walked down the narrow street, her breath forming small clouds in the chilly air. By the time she reached the precinct, the usual buzz of officers talking and phones ringing filled the space. Some heads turned when she entered, just for a moment, but quickly looked away, as if the memory of what had happened yesterday was too fresh for comfort. Emily didn't slow her steps. She made her way straight to the large glass-walled conference room at the center of the station. Inside, Deputy Chief James Warren stood, organizing papers on the long oak table. He looked up as she entered, his brow furrowed with concern. "Are you ready for this?" James asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Emily met his gaze, her expression steady. "Yes, it's time." James nodded and quietly slipped out of the room. Minutes later, officers began filing in one by one, their boots scuffing the floor. Some carried their coffee mugs, others brought notepads, but most walked in with skeptical expressions. Chris Miller, a young officer in his late 20s, slipped into a seat near the back, fiddling nervously with a pen. Emily had noticed him yesterday. He had seemed tense, but hesitant to speak. And then, Greg Sanders arrived. He swaggered in with the same cocky smirk on his face, though it faltered for a split second when he saw Emily standing at the head of the table. Greg sank into a chair at the far end, crossing his arms with a casual air, as though he was ready to watch a spectacle. Emily waited for the room to quiet before speaking. "Good morning," she began, her voice calm but firm. "I know you're all wondering why I called this meeting." The room was still, the hum of the heater in the background the only sound. "My name is Emily Carter," she continued, her gaze steady as she looked around the room. "And as of today, I am your new chief of police." The silence that followed was deafening. A few officers exchanged shocked glances, others stared openly, wide-eyed. Chris's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the table. At the far end, Greg's smirk finally vanished. "No way," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for the nearest officers to hear. His disbelief morphed into irritation. Emily didn't flinch. "Oh yes, Officer Sanders. I am your new chief of police," she said, meeting his glare with unwavering confidence. "And I have a lot to say." Greg scoffed and leaned back in his chair. "Great. Another outsider who thinks they know how things work." Emily stepped forward, placing her hands firmly on the table as she spoke. "I am not here to pretend I know everything, but I do know this: what happened yesterday should never happen in a place that claims to uphold justice." The room grew heavier with tension. Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes flickering between Emily and Greg. Emily's voice softened but held its strength. "I have spent the past few weeks observing this station. I watched how things operated when no one thought they were being watched. What I saw was disappointing." She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. "This station has the potential to be a beacon of integrity, but it has been weighed down by fear, silence, and misuse of power." Her eyes rested on Greg again. "That ends today." Greg let out a sharp, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Do you really think you can change things around here? This place doesn't need reform. It needs reality." Chris Miller tensed in his seat, but Emily held her composure. "I am not naive, Greg," she said. "I know the challenges ahead, but I also know that the people here, the ones who truly care, deserve better. And so does this community." Greg's eyes narrowed. "You can't win against the system, Chief Carter," he said, his tone filled with quiet defiance. "People like you come and go. You think you're different, but you won't last." Emily's gaze was steady. "Maybe I won't," she admitted, "but I'm not afraid to try." For a long moment, the room was silent. Then Emily straightened and reached for a leather folder she had placed on the table. "This is the first step in our reform plan," she announced. She opened the folder and spread out several pages filled with detailed outlines, mandatory ethics training, a restructured process for handling civilian complaints, and the creation of an independent oversight unit. "This is not a purge," Emily continued. "This is an opportunity for all of us to start fresh. I will not tolerate abuse of power or injustice. If you have something to hide, I suggest you come forward now, because if you don't—" She paused, her voice firm. "I will find it." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Chris shifted in his chair, but something in his expression softened a flicker of hope. Greg leaned forward, narrowing his eyes at Emily. "You can say whatever you want," he said, his voice low. "But you'll see soon enough. You'll never bring this system down." Emily met his challenge with quiet resolve. Then I guess we'll see who's right. Greg pushed back his chair and stood. He shot Emily one last defiant look before storming out of the room, the door slamming behind him. The sound echoed through the room, but Emily stood tall. She knew this wasn't just about one man. It was about changing a culture that had been left unchecked for too long. As the remaining officers sat in silence, Emily felt the weight of their doubts, but also their curiosity. She knew the journey ahead would test her, but as she looked around the room, she held on to one truth. Real change starts with resilience. The meeting ended, but the battle had only just begun. Emily Carter watched as the officers filed out of the conference room, their footsteps fading down the hall. Some whispered quietly to one another, while others walked away in thoughtful silence. The tension in the room still lingered like a thick fog. Chris Miller was the last to leave, hesitating at the door. He glanced at Emily, opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again and disappeared into the hallway. Emily took a slow, steadying breath and gathered the papers she had spread on the table. Deputy Chief James Warren entered, his face etched with concern. "That was bold," he said, crossing his arms. "It had to be," Emily replied. She placed the reform plans back into the leather folder and closed it carefully. "This isn't about one meeting, James. This is about changing how people think." James nodded, but still seemed troubled. "You've set the tone, but Greg Sanders won't go quietly." Emily's jaw tightened. "I know," she said softly, "but I'm not here to make him comfortable. I'm here to make things right." As James left to return to his office, Emily lingered in the now empty room. The early morning sunlight filtered through the windows, casting streaks of light across the table. She remembered the disbelief in Greg's eyes, the derisive laugh that had followed her every word. "He thinks I will break," she thought. "He thinks I will walk away." But Greg didn't know her. He didn't know the sacrifices she had made, the long years of battling self-doubt and resistance at every step. And he didn't know the promise she had made to her grandmother, to be a voice for the people who had none. Emily finally left the conference room and walked back to her office. The space was simple, with a small desk, a filing cabinet, and a single window that overlooked the busy street below. As she placed the folder on her desk, a soft knock at the door drew her attention. Chris Miller stood in the doorway, looking unsure. His brown hair was slightly tousled, and his uniform, though neatly pressed, seemed to hang awkwardly on his lanky frame. "Officer Miller," Emily greeted him. "Come in." Chris stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "Chief Carter," he began nervously, I just wanted to say that I thought what you said in there was brave." Emily tilted her head, studying him carefully. "Thank you," she said. "But you didn't come in here just to say that, did you?" Chris hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "No, ma'am," he admitted. "It's just, Greg has a lot of people wrapped around his finger. Some of the newer officers don't agree with him, but they're scared. And honestly, I've been scared too." Emily leaned forward, resting her hands on the desk. "You don't have to be scared anymore, Chris," she said gently. "This station can be better, but only if people like you speak up." Chris shifted from foot to foot, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I want to believe that," he said quietly. "But Greg's not just an officer. He's a symbol of how things have been for a long time." Emily nodded, understanding the weight of what he was saying. "Symbols only have power if we let them," she said. "If you ever feel ready to step forward, my door is open." Chris gave a small nod, though he still looked conflicted. "Thanks, Chief." As Chris left, Emily felt a flicker of hope. There were cracks in Greg's influence, small but present. People like Chris Miller were proof of that. Meanwhile, Greg Sanders was pacing the length of his small office, his face flushed with anger. The medals and certificates on his wall gleamed under the harsh fluorescent light, but they no longer felt like reminders of his achievements. Instead, they mocked him. "She thinks she can walk in here and change everything, he muttered bitterly. His thoughts spiraled as he replayed Emily's calm, resolute words in his mind. Greg sank into his chair and stared at the stack of papers on his desk. 15 years on the force, and this was how it was going to end? No, he wouldn't let it. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number. After a few rings, a voice answered. "It's Sanders," Greg said, keeping his voice low. "We need to talk." That afternoon, the station's usual hum of activity felt different, tense, cautious. Emily could sense the unease as she walked through the bullpen. Officers glanced at her, then quickly looked away. As she returned to her office, James Warren appeared at her door again, holding a printed news article. His face was grim. "Chief, you need to see this," he said, handing her the paper. Emily took it and read the headline. "New police chief faces scrutiny. Allegations of misconduct resurface." Her heart sank as she scanned the article. It accused her of mishandling a high-profile case years ago, claiming that she had failed to secure key evidence, leading to a suspect walking free. The details were twisted, omitting crucial facts and painting her as careless. Emily exhaled slowly, steadying herself. "This came from Greg," she said quietly. James nodded. "It's his first move," he said. "He's trying to discredit you before you can gain support." Emily placed the paper on her desk and looked out the window. The article was meant to sow doubt, to shake her confidence, and shift the focus away from Greg's behavior. But Emily wasn't easily shaken. "We need to focus on the truth," she said. "If we fight fire with fire, we'll lose. But if we stay grounded in facts and integrity, we can withstand this." James studied her for a moment, and then nodded. "What's the plan?" Emily's gaze sharpened with resolve. "We need allies. I want to know who in this station is willing to stand for what is right and who is trying to keep things buried." She turned back to the article, her mind already working through the steps they needed to take. The battle had begun in earnest, but Emily wasn't about to retreat. She had taken the first blow, but she was still standing, and that was what mattered. The sun dipped lower in the sky as Emily Carter sat alone in her office, staring at the printed article on her desk. The accusatory words felt sharp, even though she knew the truth was far more complicated. James Warren had returned to his duties after their brief discussion, but his concern lingered in her mind. She knew the station was watching, waiting for her reaction, some hoping she would falter, others silently rooting for her to hold strong. Emily leaned back in her chair, the worn leather creaking beneath her. Her eyes drifted to the framed photo of her grandmother Ruth on the small shelf by the window. The photo was old, but well-preserved Ruth, standing proudly in front of a modest community center, her arms crossed and her smile kind but determined. The sight of it pulled Emily into a memory, one she hadn't visited in a long time. Emily was 9 years old, sitting on the front steps of Ruth's small single-story house. The porch was decorated with potted flowers, though some of the petals had browned under the summer sun. Ruth sat beside her, gently peeling an orange and handing Emily the slices one at a time. "You've got to remember, Emily," Ruth said, her voice low but fierce. "Justice isn't something you wait for. You've got to work for it, even when no one believes you." Emily had nodded, though she hadn't fully understood Ruth's words at the time. But everything changed later that year. There had been a protest in the neighborhood, a peaceful march calling for safer streets and fair policing. Ruth had been one of the organizers. Emily remembered standing on the sidewalk, holding a sign far too large for her small hands. The crowd's chants echoed down the street until a line of officers blocked the way. What happened next replayed in her mind as vividly as the day it happened. One officer, tall and stern-faced, stepped forward and ordered the group to disperse. Ruth had refused. "We have a right to be here," Ruth had said calmly. In an instant, the officer had shoved Ruth backward. She hit the pavement hard, her wrist twisting unnaturally beneath her. The crowd gasped, and Emily had run to her grandmother's side, tears streaming down her face. Even in pain, Ruth had whispered to her, "Never be afraid to speak the truth, Emily. Never." Emily blinked, returning to the present. Her grandmother's words had carried her through every challenge through law school, through sleepless nights at the police academy, and through moments like this. Ruth had been strong, even when the system failed her, and Emily had promised herself that she would work from within the system to make sure others didn't suffer the same way. But it wasn't just Ruth's influence that shaped her. There had been someone else, a mentor, who had shown Emily how the law worked from the inside, how to navigate the complex world of policing: Raymond Pierce. A respected officer with 3 decades on the force, Raymond had taken Emily under his wing during her first year as a detective. He had taught her how to analyze evidence, interview witnesses, and most importantly, how to keep her integrity intact, no matter how difficult it became. For years, Emily had seen Raymond as a second father. But then came the investigation that changed everything. Emily had been assigned to review a case that appeared, on the surface, to be routine. But as she dug deeper, she found disturbing discrepancies, missing reports, falsified signatures, and an alarming number of financial transfers that couldn't be explained. Her heart had dropped when she saw Raymond's name linked to several of the documents. At first, she refused to believe it. She stayed late every night, combing through files, hoping to find some explanation that would clear his name. But the deeper she looked, the clearer the truth became. Finally, she had confronted him in his office. Raymond had looked tired, worn down by years of compromise. "You don't understand, Emily," he had said quietly. "The system isn't built to help people like us. If you don't learn to play by their rules, you get crushed." His words had been like a punch to the gut. She had trusted him, admired him. But in the end, he was just another cog in the broken machine she was trying to fix. Emily had walked out of his office that day feeling hollow. But she hadn't let it stop her. Instead, she had doubled down on her efforts to build something better. A knock at the door pulled her out of her thoughts. "Come in," she called. James Warren stepped inside, holding a thick manila folder. "I thought you should see this," he said, placing it on her desk. Emily opened the folder and scanned the contents. Inside were detailed records of Greg Sanders' actions over the past several years, citizen complaints that had mysteriously disappeared, misconduct reports that had been dismissed without investigation, and testimonies from junior officers who had felt too intimidated to come forward. James sat across from her, folding his hands. "Chris Miller dug some of this up," he said. "He overheard Greg talking in the locker room and followed his gut. He's scared, but he's trying to do the right thing." Emily's heart stirred. Chris, the nervous young officer who had barely been able to meet her gaze earlier, was starting to show real courage. "Good," Emily said. "This is a start." James hesitated, then asked, "What are you thinking?" Emily's gaze hardened as she closed the folder. "I'm thinking we need more than this. If we are going to take Greg down, we need to expose everything, his entire network, every person who covered for him." James nodded slowly. "That's dangerous. You know that, right?" Emily leaned forward, her expression resolute. "I do. But this isn't just about one officer. It's about proving that justice isn't a game for the powerful. It belongs to everyone." James exhaled and stood. "Then we better get to work." As he left, Emily looked out the window again. The street below was bustling with life, people walking, cars honking, the city continuing as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. Emily had faced betrayal before, and it had only made her stronger. She wasn't here to make deals or play by someone else's rules. She was here to tear down the walls of corruption and rebuild something better. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind once more. "Never be afraid to speak the truth." Emily smiled faintly. "I won't, Ruth. Not ever." The hum of the precinct was subdued the next morning, as if the air itself held its breath. Emily Carter walked through the bullpen with calm purpose, but the tension in the room was palpable. Conversation stopped as she passed, replaced by exchanged glances and murmured words too low to catch. She knew the whispers were about her. The article accusing her of past misconduct had done its damage. Doubt had a way of spreading like wildfire, especially in a place already divided. Emily reached her office and closed the door behind her. The moment she was alone, she allowed herself a slow breath. She knew what this was. Greg Sanders' first shot across the bow. His goal was simple: discredit her before she could gain any real foothold. Her phone buzzed on her desk. The screen lit up with a message from James Warren. "We need to meet." Chris found something else. Emily felt her pulse quicken. She grabbed her notepad and headed toward the small conference room where James was waiting. When she arrived, James stood by the whiteboard, arms crossed. Chris Miller was already seated, looking more nervous than ever. His foot tapped anxiously beneath the table, and he barely looked up as Emily took her seat. James cleared his throat. "Chris has been digging deeper into Greg's circle," he began, "and what he's found, well, it's troubling." Emily turned toward Chris, who fumbled with the stack of papers in front of him before finally sliding them across the table. "I overheard a few officers talking near the break room," Chris said, his voice quiet but steady. "They mentioned a meeting at the Cornerstone Bar last night. Greg was there with some of his guys, and they weren't just talking about you." Emily's brow furrowed as she scanned the notes Chris had taken. What were they discussing? Chris swallowed hard. They were strategizing, trying to figure out how to keep certain reports from resurfacing complaints that had been handled years ago. And he hesitated before continuing. "They mentioned Mark Callahan." Emily's hand froze on the page. The name hit her like a punch to the gut. Mark Callahan was a high-ranking city official, a man with enough influence to keep anyone in line if they stepped out of bounds. If he was involved, the corruption reached far higher than she had expected. James leaned forward. "If Greg has Callahan in his corner, that explains why the complaints against him never gained traction. He's been protected from the top." Emily nodded slowly, her mind already racing. "This isn't just about Greg, then," she said quietly. "It's a network, a system built to protect itself." Chris shifted in his seat. "I know this is dangerous," he admitted, "but I couldn't stay quiet anymore." Emily looked at the young officer, admiration flickering in her eyes. "You did the right thing, Chris," she said, "and I promise you, you're not alone." Chris managed a small, grateful nod. James leaned back, his expression grim. "So, what now? We have some records, notes, and whispers, but it's not enough. If we're going to take this to the public, we need concrete proof." Emily stared at the papers spread across the table, thinking. "We need to trace the cover-ups to their source," she said. "Find out exactly how deep this goes, and we need to do it quietly. If Greg or Callahan catch wind of this, they'll erase whatever's left." James nodded. "Understood." Emily stood and gathered the papers. "We need to be ready when the time comes. But for now, we move carefully." Meanwhile, in Greg Sanders' office, the mood was far from quiet. Greg paced in front of his desk, his phone pressed to his ear. "You told me this would be contained," Greg snapped, his voice low but furious. "But now she's digging deeper. If she finds anything else, it's over." On the other end of the line, a smooth, confident voice replied, "Relax, Sanders. She won't find anything because there won't be anything left to find." Greg gritted his teeth, frustration boiling beneath the surface. "Callahan, you better be right." Callahan chuckled. "I always am." The call ended, and Greg slammed the phone down onto his desk. He sat heavily in his chair, running a hand over his face. For years, he had built his power within the station, untouchable because of his connections. But now, for the first time, he felt the cracks forming beneath his feet, and it terrified him. That evening, Emily returned to her apartment. The city lights blinked outside her window as she placed her bag on the kitchen table. She had picked up takeout from the diner down the street, but she wasn't hungry. Her mind was still turning over everything Chris had uncovered. As she sat down, her eyes drifted to her grandmother's picture again. Ruth's steady gaze seemed to remind her that justice wasn't about speed, it was about persistence. A knock at the door startled her. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened it, she found Mrs. Henderson, her elderly neighbor, standing there with a small plate of cookies. "I saw your light on," Mrs. Henderson said kindly. "Thought you could use something sweet." Emily blinked, momentarily speechless at the simple gesture. "Thank you," she said, taking the plate. Mrs. Henderson smiled. "You remind me of your grandmother, you know. Always working hard, always standing tall." Emily's throat tightened. "That means a lot," she said softly. Mrs. Henderson reached out and patted Emily's hand. "You're not alone, Emily," she said. "There are good people in this city who want you to succeed." After Mrs. Henderson left, Emily sat at her table, the plate of cookies untouched for now. The encounter was small, but it mattered more than words could express. She picked up her notepad and began drafting her next steps. Her determination rekindled. She knew the road ahead was steep, but Mrs. Henderson's quiet reminder stayed with her. For every shadow cast by corruption, there was also light, and it was her job to make sure that light grew stronger. The next morning, Emily Carter was already at the precinct before the sun rose. The office was quiet, save for the hum of a lone vending machine in the corner. The stillness suited her. There was something grounding about starting the day in silence before the chaos began. She placed a fresh stack of notes and reports on her desk. Chris Miller's findings had given her a thread to pull, and she intended to unravel every inch of it. The deeper she dug, the clearer the pattern became. Complaints buried, evidence misplaced, reports doctored. And in almost every instance, Greg Sanders' name appeared somewhere in the chain. But what unnerved Emily the most was the presence of Mark Callahan, a man who held significant influence at the city level. He wasn't just protecting Greg, he was orchestrating the cover-ups, using his authority to shield the corruption. A quiet knock at her door broke her concentration. When she looked up, James Warren stepped in, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You need this," James said, setting a cup on her desk. "And you're going to need it even more after what I have to tell you." Emily arched an eyebrow as she took a sip. "What's happened?" James pulled a folded newspaper from under his arm and laid it on her desk. The bold headline read, "Chief of Police Under Fire, Allegations of Internal Disruption." Emily felt the familiar churn of anger in her stomach as she scanned the article. It claimed that her leadership had caused division among the department, and morale was at an all-time low. Anonymous sources likely handpicked by Greg were quoted, painting Emily as an outsider who didn't understand the dynamics of the station. James exhaled, watching her carefully. "It's another coordinated hit," he said. "They're trying to turn the public against you before you can expose the truth." Emily nodded, setting the paper aside. "I expected this," she said. "Greg's not just fighting to keep his power, he's fighting to survive. And he's desperate." James took a seat across from her. "Desperation makes people dangerous." Emily leaned forward, her voice steady. "Then we need to act before he escalates. We need something irrefutable, something that will make it impossible for him to hide behind Callahan or anyone else." James hesitated. "Chris found one more thing, but it's risky." Emily's gaze sharpened. "Go on." James lowered his voice. "There's an off-site storage room, an old evidence locker Greg uses to hide records he doesn't want anyone to see. Chris overheard 2 officers talking about it. If the files are still there, they could be the final piece we need." Emily's pulse quickened. "Where is it?" James handed her a small slip of paper. "An old storage facility on the east side of town." Emily stared at the address, her mind already racing. If the evidence was real, it could dismantle the entire network. But getting to it without tipping Greg off was another challenge entirely. Later that afternoon, Emily called Chris into her office. The young officer stepped in cautiously, his usual nervous energy tempered by a quiet resolve. "Officer Miller," Emily began, "I need your help." Chris straightened at her words. "Anything, Chief?" Emily handed him the slip of paper with the address. "This is the location of an off-site storage facility. We believe Greg has been hiding sensitive files there. We need to get those records, but it has to be discreet." Chris swallowed hard but nodded. "I can do it." Emily leaned forward, her tone serious. "This isn't just a small risk, Chris. If Greg finds out, he won't hesitate to retaliate." Chris met her gaze, his jaw tightening. "I know, but this is the right thing to do." Emily felt a surge of pride. "We'll do this together," she said. "You won't be alone." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily and Chris drove toward the east side of town in an unmarked car. The storage facility was located near an old industrial park, quiet, isolated, and partially hidden by rows of abandoned buildings. Emily parked a short distance away, and they walked the rest of the way in silence. The facility's chain-link fence was rusted, the security cameras too outdated to be functional. Chris glanced nervously at the dimly lit entrance. "You sure this is it?" Emily nodded. "If Greg was hiding something, it would be somewhere like this." They slipped inside, their footsteps muffled on the concrete floor. Rows of old lockers and storage crates lined the walls, each marked with faded labels. Emily's heart pounded as they searched. After several minutes, Chris called out, "Chief, over here!" Emily hurried over to where Chris stood in front of a large, padlocked storage locker. The label read, "Case Materials Restricted." Chris held up a small crowbar he had found near one of the shelves. Emily gave him a nod, and with a quick motion, Chris broke the rusted lock. The locker door groaned as it swung open, revealing stacks of boxes and binders. Emily's breath caught in her chest. Each box was labeled with familiar case names, cases involving civilian complaints, internal investigations, and reports that had mysteriously vanished over the years. Chris pulled out a binder and flipped it open. Inside were detailed records of falsified reports and bribery transactions. Emily recognized several names, including Mark Callahan's, listed next to suspicious payment entries. "This is it," Emily whispered. Chris's eyes widened. This could bring down everyone involved. Emily reached for her phone to take pictures of the files, but a noise at the far end of the facility made them both freezes. Footsteps. Emily grabbed Chris's arm, pulling him into the shadows behind a tall shelving unit. She could see the silhouette of a figure entering the facility, a flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Her heart pounded in her chest. "Stay quiet," she whispered. The figure moved closer, scanning the rows of lockers. Emily recognized the officer's face. It was Greg's closest ally, Officer Peters. Chris's breathing was shallow as they watched Peters step closer to the broken lock. He swore under his breath when he saw the open door and the empty binder in Emily's hand. Emily tightened her grip on the binder. She knew they couldn't stay hidden for long. She exchanged a quick glance with Chris and mouthed, "Follow my lead." Emily stepped out of the shadows, her voice calm but firm. "Looking for something, Peters?" Peters froze, his flashlight beam swinging toward her. His eyes widened as he registered who it was. "Chief Carter?" Emily raised her chin. "I suggest you walk away and forget you saw us, or you can explain to me why you're here after hours." Peters hesitated, clearly weighing his options. After a tense pause, he muttered something under his breath and backed toward the exit. Once he was gone, Emily exhaled slowly. Chris looked at her, his eyes wide with relief. "That was close." Emily nodded, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "But we have what we need." They gathered as many files as they could carry before slipping out of the building and making their way back to the car. As they drove back toward the city, Emily knew the fight was far from over. But for the first time, they had something concrete evidence that could shatter Greg's network and expose the corruption once and for all. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened as she glanced at Chris. "This is the beginning of the end for them," she said. Chris nodded, determination lighting his face. "Let's finish this." The air was thick with tension as Emily Carter and Chris Miller pulled into the police station parking lot. The weight of the files in the back seat felt heavier than it should have, as though the truth itself carried mass. Emily shut off the engine and turned to Chris, who was staring at the building with a nervous but determined expression. "You sure you're ready for this?" Emily asked, her voice calm but serious. Chris nodded. "If we do not act now, nothing will ever change." Emily gave a small, approving nod. "Good. Let's go." Inside the station, the usual buzz of activity had settled into something quieter, almost too quiet. Whispers drifted from desk to desk, but conversations stopped the moment Emily and Chris stepped in. Eyes followed their every move as they made their way toward the conference room. Deputy Chief James Warren was already there, standing by the long oak table with arms crossed. When Emily and Chris entered, James's expression shifted from concern to focus. "Did you get what you were looking for?" James asked. Emily placed the heavy stack of binders and files on the table. "We got more than that," she replied. She opened one of the binders, flipping through pages filled with damning details, hidden payments, false reports, and emails linking Greg Sanders to Callahan's network. James's eyes widened as he scanned the documents. This is everything," he muttered. "This could dismantle the whole system." Emily leaned over the table. "Exactly. But we have to be smart about how we handle this. If we move too soon, they will have time to cover their tracks, or worse, they will frame us as the aggressors." Chris swallowed hard. "So, what do we do now?" Emily straightened, her voice steady. "We call a press conference. Public exposure is our only defense against them burying this. We need to show the city that the corruption runs deep and that we have proof." James nodded slowly. "I will make the arrangements. But Emily, this is not just about Greg anymore. You are going up against people with serious connections. Once this is out there, there is no going back." Emily met his gaze with quiet resolve. "I know," she said, "but the truth is, the only way forward." By midday, news of the press conference had spread. Reporters began gathering outside the station, microphones in hand, cameras set up to catch every angle. Inside, the station felt like a pressure cooker. Some officers paced nervously, while others stayed silent, watching the events unfold. Greg Sanders was not among them. In his small office, Greg sat at his desk, the blinds half drawn to block out the commotion outside. He was unnervingly still, his fingers laced together. He had heard about the press conference, and he knew without even needing confirmation that Emily Carter had found the evidence he had fought for years to keep buried. A soft knock sounded at his door before Officer Peters stepped inside, his face pale. "Sir, they have everything," Peters said. "The files, the payments, Callahan's involvement." Greg's jaw clenched, but his face remained otherwise impassive. "I see." Peters shifted uncomfortably. "What do we do?" Greg finally stood, adjusting his collar and brushing an invisible speck of dust from his shoulder. "We remind them who runs this city." Emily stood in front of the gathered crowd outside the station, a line of cameras pointed at her like a firing squad. James and Chris stood off to the side, their presence a quiet but steady source of support. Emily took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice carrying over the quiet murmurs of the crowd. "Today, I am here to address not only the allegations that have been made against me, but also the deeper issues within our system that have allowed corruption to thrive unchecked." The reporters leaned forward, pens poised and cameras zoomed in. Emily held up one of the files for all to see. "This is a record of falsified reports, hidden payments, and misconduct dating back years. It implicates not only one officer, but an entire network including high-ranking officials who have used their influence to protect themselves rather than serve the people they were sworn to protect. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Emily began reading excerpts from the files, names, dates, dollar amounts. She left nothing out. The atmosphere shifted as the weight of the truth settled in. For many of the reporters, the story had suddenly become much bigger than they had anticipated. Emily took a steadying breath before continuing. I know that trust in this department has been shaken. I am not here to deny the mistakes that have been made. But I am here to ensure that justice prevails, that those who have abused their power will face accountability, no matter who they are. She stepped back from the podium as the reporters erupted with questions. Cameras flashed, and voices overlapped in a chaotic hum. Emily's heart pounded, but she kept her expression composed. This was the moment she had been working toward, the moment when the truth finally broke free. Inside his office, Greg watched the live broadcast on his small television. His expression was blank, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of his desk. Peters hovered near the doorway, nervously wringing his hands. It is over, isn't it? Greg slowly turned off the television and stood. His eyes were dark, his usual smirk replaced by something colder. Not yet. The fallout from the press conference was immediate. Within hours, local news stations were running non-stop coverage of Emily's revelations. Public opinion, once divided, began to shift. Calls for accountability flooded City Hall. Citizens gathered outside the station, not to protest, but to support the movement for change. But Emily knew this was only the beginning. She had exposed the truth, but now she had to prepare for the counterattack. Later that evening, as she sat in her office, James and Chris entered, their expressions serious but hopeful. "You did it, Chief," Chris said, a hint of pride in his voice. "The city is finally listening." Emily allowed herself a small, tired smile. "We did it," she corrected. James nodded. "But they are not done fighting. Greg won't go down without a final play." Emily's smile faded. "Then we need to be ready. The fight is not over yet, but we are closer than ever." The night outside grew darker, but inside the station, a quiet strength began to take root. Emily knew there would be more challenges ahead, but for the first time, she felt the winds of change begin to stir. And she wasn't afraid. The city buzzed with the aftermath of Emily Carter's press conference. News channels replayed her speech in an endless loop, breaking down every detail of the exposed corruption. Commentators speculated on what the fallout would mean for the police force and for the city leaders who had stayed silent for too long. Meanwhile, within the station, the air was taut with anticipation. Officers who had once kept their heads down now exchanged glances of cautious optimism. But beneath the surface, there was still fear. Everyone knew Greg Sanders was not the type to accept defeat quietly. In his office, Greg sat at his desk, the blinds drawn shut. The only light came from the glow of his desk lamp, casting shadows across his face. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a simmering rage. His fingers drummed a slow, steady rhythm on the desk as he stared at the phone in front of him. The line rang once before being picked up. "It's time," Greg said, his voice low. On the other end, Mark Callahan exhaled sharply. "You better have a plan," Callahan warned, "because right now, you're not just a liability, you're a loose end." Greg's jaw tightened. "If I go down, I am taking you with me. Don't forget that." There was a brief silence before Callahan responded, his tone colder than before. "Then you better make sure you don't lose." The call ended, leaving Greg in the heavy silence of his office. He stared at the folders stacked on his desk, records of every favor, every cover-up. They had been his armor for years, but now they felt like chains tightening around his neck. Greg stood abruptly and grabbed his coat. He had one last card to play. Emily's office was calm, despite the whirlwind of events outside. She sat at her desk, sifting through a stack of supportive messages from community members who had watched the press conference. Some were brief thank yous. Others told stories of how they had lost faith in the system but felt hope for the first time in years. There was a knock at the door, and James Warren stepped in, looking grim. "We've got a problem," he said without preamble. Emily set the letters aside. "What happened?" James closed the door behind him. "Greg is trying to spin the narrative. There's a new article circulating anonymous sources claiming that the files you presented were fabricated." Emily's stomach tightened, though she kept her face calm. "Fabricated?" James nodded. "They're saying you staged the entire thing to bolster your own reputation. The story's picking up traction with Callahan's allies in the media." Emily leaned back in her chair, her mind working quickly. This is Greg's last-ditch effort. He knows the evidence is real. He's just trying to muddy the waters. James sat down across from her. "So, what do we do?" Emily exhaled slowly. "We stay the course. We keep presenting the truth and let the facts speak for themselves. And we need to prepare for their next move, whatever it is." Just then, Chris Miller appeared in the doorway, breathless. "Chief, you need to come downstairs. Now." Emily and James exchanged a brief, worried glance before standing and following Chris down the hall. The hum of tension grew louder as they reached the main floor of the station. Officers had gathered near the entrance, whispering and pointing toward the glass doors. Outside, a crowd of protesters had formed, their signs and chants filling the air. Some of the signs read, "Justice for Greg Sanders" and "End the Smear Campaign." Emily's heart sank. The seeds Greg had planted with his lies were sprouting into something dangerous. Chris shook his head in disbelief. "How does he still have this much influence?" James crossed his arms. "Fear and desperation." Emily stepped forward, observing the crowd through the glass. She could see a few familiar faces, people who had been outspoken critics of the station long before she had arrived. But there were others, too, people who had likely been misled by the fabricated story. One man at the front of the crowd caught her attention. He was waving a sign that read, "We deserve the truth." His face was flushed with anger, and his voice carried above the others. "She's destroying this department," he shouted. "She doesn't care about us." Emily felt a pang in her chest, not from his words, but from the realization that the fight for justice had been twisted into something else in their minds. James stepped closer. "We can call for backup if things get out of hand." Emily shook her head. "No, that'll only escalate things." She took a deep breath, straightened her jacket, and opened the front doors. The officers behind her exchanged worried glances, but didn't try to stop her. As Emily stepped outside, the noise swelled. Chants grew louder, signs waved higher, but she didn't flinch. She walked calmly to the top of the steps and raised her hand for silence. The crowd didn't quiet at first, but gradually the shouts began to fade as more people noticed her presence. "I understand your anger," Emily began, her voice clear and steady. "I understand your frustration, but you deserve the truth, not rumors, not distractions." The man with the sign lowered it slightly, narrowing his eyes at her. "Then tell us," he called. "Did you fabricate those files?" Emily met his gaze without wavering. "No," she said firmly. "Every document we presented is real. Every report, every signature, it's all been verified. But I know that words aren't enough. That's why I've invited an independent investigative team to review everything. They will have full access to the evidence, and they will answer to no one but the public." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The man with the sign hesitated, as though weighing her words. "You have the right to question authority," Emily continued, "but you also have the right to demand accountability from those who would deceive you. Greg Sanders betrayed the trust you placed in him. I won't do the same." The crowd grew quiet, though not entirely convinced. Still, Emily could see a shift. Some of the tension had begun to ease. She took a step back and nodded at the officers behind her. "Let them be heard," she said softly, "but make sure it stays peaceful." As Emily re-entered the station, Chris was staring at her with something close to awe. "How do you stay that calm?" he asked. Emily offered a small, tired smile. "I remind myself why I'm here." James nodded. "That was brave, but Greg won't stop. He's still out there, and he's desperate." Emily's eyes hardened with resolve. "Then we need to make sure the investigation happens quickly. If the truth comes out in time, they won't have anything left to stand on." She paused, glancing back at the crowd through the glass. "This isn't just about proving Greg wrong. It's about showing the community what justice really looks like." Chris nodded, his shoulders straightening. "We're with you, Chief." Emily's heart swelled with gratitude. "Good," she said, "because this fight is far from over." As the team returned to work, Emily felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle over her shoulders. But beneath it, there was something stronger, a steady flame of determination. No matter how many desperate moves Greg made, she would hold her ground. Justice wasn't just an idea to her, it was a promise, and she intended to keep it. The following morning, the station felt like it was holding its breath. Conversations were muted, officers moved with caution, and the phones rang more frequently with calls from reporters and concerned citizens. Emily Carter sat in her office, sifting through the latest reports and preparing for the next phase of their strategy. The independent investigative team had agreed to begin their review of the files that afternoon. If everything went smoothly, the truth would soon be undeniable to everyone, including Greg Sanders' most loyal supporters. A soft knock at the door broke her focus. "Come in," Emily called. Chris Miller stepped inside, carrying a thick folder. His usual nervous energy was gone, replaced by quiet determination. "Chief, I compiled everything the investigators requested: case logs, complaint reports, financial records. It's all ready." Emily gave him a grateful nod. "Good work, Chris. This is what we've been waiting for." Chris hesitated for a moment, then took a seat across from her. "Do you think they'll listen? The people who still believe Greg?" Emily sighed, folding her hands on the desk. "Some might, others won't. But that doesn't change what we need to do. The truth isn't always enough to convince everyone, but it's still worth fighting for." Chris nodded slowly. "I've seen officers scared to speak up for years, but after yesterday, I think some of them are starting to believe things can change." Emily's lips curved into a small, hopeful smile. "We're getting there, Chris. One step at a time." Down the street, at a sleek high-rise office overlooking the city, Mark Callahan leaned back in his leather chair, his phone pressed to his ear. "You promised me this would be handled," he snapped. "And now we've got independent investigators breathing down our necks." Greg Sanders' voice crackled on the other end. "You think I don't know that? I'm working on it." Callahan's tone turned icy. "Work faster. If this investigation confirms what she says, you and I are done." Greg's response was a low growl. "She's not invincible, Callahan. Everyone has a weak spot." The line went dead, and Callahan cursed under his breath. For years, he had operated comfortably in the shadows, pulling strings and making deals to maintain his power. But now the cracks were showing, and they were spreading fast. By the afternoon, the independent investigative team had arrived at the station. A group of 5 professionals, 2 attorneys, 2 forensic accountants, and a retired federal agent entered the conference room with quiet efficiency. Their presence immediately shifted the energy in the building. Emily greeted them at the door, her handshake firm but respectful. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You have full access to everything you need." The lead investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Rachel Porter, nodded. "We'll be thorough." James Warren joined Emily as the team began unpacking their laptops and reviewing the stacks of files Chris had assembled. "This is it," James said quietly. Emily nodded. "No more hiding." Hours passed as the investigators worked. The tension outside the conference room grew with every passing minute. Officers glanced toward the glass windows, whispering about what was unfolding behind the closed doors. At one point, Chris walked past Greg Sanders's office and noticed the door slightly ajar. Greg sat at his desk, unmoving, staring blankly at his wall of certificates and medals. There was something hollow in his eyes, but when he noticed Chris watching, his expression twisted into a scowl. Chris quickly looked away and continued walking, but the encounter left his stomach in knots. As the evening sun cast long shadows across the station floor, Rachel Porter and her team emerged from the conference room. Emily and James stood as the lead investigator approached, a folder tucked under her arm. "We've completed our preliminary review," Rachel announced, "and there's no question the documents you presented are authentic. The paper trails match perfectly with city financial records and internal emails. There's overwhelming evidence of systemic corruption." Emily felt a wave of relief, though she kept her expression composed. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "When will you be ready to release your findings?" Rachel's eyes were steady. "We'll prepare a full report by tomorrow morning. Once it's public, there will be no way for anyone to dismiss it." James exhaled slowly. "That's the confirmation we needed." Rachel nodded. "But be prepared. When this goes public, the people you're up against are going to panic, and desperate people make dangerous choices." Emily's jaw tightened. "We'll be ready." That night, as Emily prepared to leave the station, she spotted Chris lingering near the exit. "Heading out?" she asked as she approached. Chris nodded, but looked distracted. "Yeah, but I'm worried about something." Emily paused, her eyes softening. "What is it?" Chris hesitated before speaking. "Greg. He didn't look defeated. He looked like he was planning something." Emily's expression grew serious. "We'll keep an eye on him. You did the right thing by telling me." Chris gave a small nod. "I don't want him to undo everything we've fought for." Emily placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "He won't. We're stronger than he is, Chris, and we're not alone anymore." As Chris left, Emily stood at the station doors, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The final pieces of the truth were falling into place, but she knew this wasn't the end. Greg wouldn't surrender quietly. He would try to take one last desperate swing, but this time she would be ready. In her mind, she could almost hear her grandmother Ruth's voice. "Justice doesn't break when it's tested. It bends, but it always finds a way to stand tall again." Emily smiled faintly. "We're almost there, Ruth." She locked the doors behind her and stepped into the cool night air, her heart steady and resolute. Tomorrow, the truth would be known. And this time, there would be no way for Greg Sanders or anyone else to hide from it. The next morning, the city woke to headlines that shook every corner of Westbridge. Independent investigation confirms systemic corruption in police force. The news spread like wildfire on television screens, radio stations, and social media feeds. Articles detailed every falsified report, every hidden payment, and every name tied to Greg Sanders' network, including Mark Callahan. The report was damning, thorough, and irrefutable. Inside the station, the atmosphere was surreal. Officers moved carefully, as though afraid their footsteps might shatter the fragile calm. Emily Carter sat in her office, watching the press conference on the local news as the investigation's lead, Rachel Porter, presented their findings to the public. Rachel's voice was clear and unshakable. The investigation confirms that multiple high-ranking officials were involved in a cover-up spanning years. This was not the failure of one person, but of a network that prioritized power over justice. James Warren entered, holding 2 mugs of coffee. He set one on Emily's desk and took a long sip from his own. "You did it," he said quietly, though there was pride in his eyes. Emily exhaled slowly. "We all did it." James nodded. "The mayor has called an emergency meeting. Callahan's resignation was announced an hour ago, and Internal Affairs issued arrest warrants for Greg and 3 of his closest allies." Emily's heart steadied at the news, but she knew the hardest part wasn't over. And Greg? James's face hardened. Gone. No one's seen him since yesterday. Emily set her coffee down. Then we need to find him before this turn into something worse. By mid-morning, teams of officers were dispatched to locate Greg Sanders. They checked his house, his usual haunts, and even his vacation property an hour outside the city. Each report came back the same nothing. Emily paced the length of the conference room, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on her. James and Chris watched in silence until Chris finally spoke. "Do you think he'll try to run?" Chris asked, his voice low. Emily shook her head. "No, Greg's not a runner. He's the type to try to take control until the very end." As if on cue, an officer entered the room, his face pale. "Chief, we just got a tip. Greg Sanders was seen at the old water treatment plant on the outskirts of town." Emily felt her pulse quicken. "Is he armed?" The officer nodded. "Likely." Emily's jaw tightened. "James, call in backup. Chris, you're with me." The drive to the water treatment plant was tense, the only sound the low hum of the tires on the road. The sky was overcast, gray clouds gathering in ominous clusters. Chris's grip on the dashboard was tight. "Do you think he's dangerous?" Emily glanced at him. "Greg's desperate. Desperate people make reckless choices. But he's not unpredictable. He'll want to control the narrative." The old treatment plant came into view, a hulking structure of rusted metal and crumbling concrete. It had been abandoned for years, its broken windows giving it the appearance of a wounded giant. Emily pulled the car to a stop and stepped out, her senses on high alert. She could hear the distant drip of water from the cracked pipes and the faint whistle of wind through the open windows. Chris followed her closely as they entered the main chamber. The air was damp and cold, and the sound of their footsteps echoed in the cavernous space. Then they saw him. Greg Sanders stood near the edge of the main platform, his back to them. His once pristine uniform was rumpled, and his shoulders sagged beneath the weight of his failure. In one hand, he held a folder, the same folder Emily had shown at the press conference. "Greg," Emily called out, her voice steady but not unkind. Greg didn't turn around. "I gave everything to this job," he said, his voice hollow. 15 years. And now, it's all gone." Emily stepped forward cautiously. "It didn't have to be this way, Greg." Greg let out a bitter laugh. "You don't get it, do you? I was trying to survive in a system that eats people alive. I wasn't trying to be a hero, I just didn't want to be a victim." Chris shifted uneasily beside Emily, but she held out her hand, signaling him to stay calm. "You let fear control you," Emily said gently. "But it doesn't have to end like this. You can still make it right." Greg finally turned, his face lined with exhaustion and anger. "It's too late for that." Emily's gaze softened. "No, it's not. You've made mistakes, terrible ones. But you can still take responsibility." Greg's grip tightened on the folder. His eyes darted to the platform's edge, where the concrete crumbled away into the reservoir below. Emily stepped closer, her voice unwavering. "Greg, this isn't the way. No one wins if you walk away from this." For a moment, Greg's expression flickered with something remorse, perhaps, but it was quickly replaced by resignation. "I lost everything, Carter. You took it all." "No," Emily said quietly. "You lost it because you forgot who you were supposed to be." There was a long silence. Then Greg lowered the folder and let it fall to the ground. Chris exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Greg's shoulders sagged even more. "What happens now?" Emily stepped forward and placed a hand on his arm. "You tell the truth, and you face the consequences." Greg nodded slowly, as though the fight had finally left him. Within minutes, the backup team arrived. Greg was escorted out in cuffs, his head bowed but his steps steady. As the patrol car carrying Greg pulled away, Emily stood beside Chris and James, the three of them watching in silence. You did it, James said after a long pause. It's over. Emily shook her head. It's not over, but it's a start. The following weeks were filled with reforms and rebuilding. Officers who had once stayed silent began stepping forward with stories of intimidation and cover-ups. Community meetings were held to restore transparency and trust. Chris Miller, once the nervous rookie afraid to speak up, became a key advocate for change within the department. And Emily Carter, through her resilience and integrity, became a symbol of hope. At one community forum, an elderly woman approached Emily after her speech. "My son was one of the people hurt by the system," the woman said, her eyes shining with gratitude. "But you gave him justice." "Thank you." Emily clasped the woman's hands. "We're just getting started," she said warmly. That night, as Emily sat alone in her apartment, she looked out at the city lights, thinking of her grandmother Ruth's unwavering belief in justice. The journey had been long, painful, and full of unexpected challenges. But Ruth had been right. Justice wasn't something you waited for, it was something you fought for, piece by piece. And as Emily closed her eyes, she knew they had taken the first step towards something better. A new dawn had begun. Emily Carter's story is a powerful reminder that justice is not simply given, it is earned through perseverance, courage, and unwavering integrity. In the face of corruption and fear, one person's determination can ignite a movement that creates lasting change. Her journey shows us that even when the path seems steep, when we choose resilience over defeat, and when we refuse to be silenced, hope can triumph. Justice is not the destination, it is the journey we take together, one step at a time. What would you do in the face of injustice? Would you stand up, speak out, and be part of the change? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Let's keep the conversation going. Your voice matters. If this story inspired you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Join us for more powerful stories of courage, resilience, and hope. Together, we can make a difference, starting with ourselves. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter of change.